These changes to super are more in the future, and indeed the legislation hasn't yet gone through Parliament for all of them, but let's get cracking on those topics. The first one there is that company directors, there's legislation in the Parliament that is not yet passed, but this legislation will make company directors personally liable for any unpaid super guarantee contributions. So right now, company directors will also be personally liable for any unpaid PAYG withholding from the tax that's taken out of people's wages. But in the future, if this legislation is passed, those company directors will also become personally liable if there's unpaid super. Now, this is subject to a lot of lobbying. I was reading something the other day from the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and there's a lot of fierce lobbying going on about it. Second point, and this is there's no legislation yet drafted, but it's certainly been announced by the government as policy that the super guarantee will move from 9%, the current rate, to 12% by 2019. I'll cover that off when we get to the slide. The last point, I think, is probably I think it's probably a reasonable thing to be done, but it does mean that a lot of businesses will need to review their payroll software, because it's going to be a requirement that super contributions are printed onto people's payslips each pay period. Okay, now we've probably covered off a number of these points. Just read quickly through there. So there's a director penalty regime. That's how directors can become personally liable for PAYG withholding in the current circumstance. That director penalty regime will be extended if these bills are passed through the Parliament. If it's not actually known, if the company has not actually reported the super liability, the tax office can estimate that liability, and then it can issue a director's penalty notice on the directors, making them personally liable for the super guarantee. Now, interestingly, if that all happens and the government levies that super guarantee amount on the director, the government's going to collect it, not the super fund. It will then be up to the employee to claim the superannuation back from the government. I wonder if it's not a revenue-raising measure or what. The super guarantee to move to 12%. Okay, so the current rate is 9%. The announcements from the government are saying that it will increment in 0.25% increments in July 2013 and 2014. So July 2013, it'll become 9.25%. 2014, 9.5%. Thereafter, it will increment in 0.5% tranches each year through to 2019. Now, I haven't actually added that all up. I expect that it does mean that by 2019 you'll be paying 12% in super. Government says that it means that someone that's 30 years old now will have an additional $108,000 in their superannuation when they retire. They say that it means there'll be an additional $10 billion in super funds by 2020 and an additional $35 billion in super funds by 2035. Now, this is not yet legislated, but interestingly, the Coalition have lent the announcement support subject to them being able to find budget savings to fund the difference in the tax rate. Superannuation contributions are taxed at 15%. If there weren't the additional contributions, then presumably companies would pay more company tax at 30%. And so the issue is, how does the government fund the difference between 30 and 15% in the tax rates? And the Coalition says if they can find that difference by savings elsewhere, they will support this legislation. and that means businesses will be paying additional superannuation guarantee. It also means that employees will have larger retirement savings. Super contributions on the payslips. I think really that's fairly straightforward, and there's not too much more to say about it, apart from saying that payroll clerks and businesses will need to make sure that their software is capable of printing that onto payslips. So it's when the super contribution is actually paid, not when it's due to be paid or not when it's accrued. It's when it's actually paid that it will need to be printed on the payslips. The other thing there is that super funds will be required to provide a quarterly notification of contributions that they've received, and I guess that gives the ability for the employee to compare the information from the super fund to what's being disclosed on payslips.